Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos and my very first acting role when I was a very small boy was in a pantomime cow. I was mooed off the stage. Well, enough of that, I think. Let's move from something terrible, that joke, to something wonderful. That's the Royal Scottish Conservatoire, and here on Musical Talk we've had calls before to marvel at the wonder of that particular organisation. It is the premier Scottish acting school, and it's an organisation that should be known by any fan of musical theatre, particularly those who are interested in new musical theatre, because it does something wonderful every year at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. It puts on a large-scale production of a well-known, already successful show. Last year it was Legally Blonde, but in recent years it's been anything as diverse as Into the Woods and 9 to 5. But even more enjoyably, they also now always commission 2 new pieces of musical theatre. And in the last 2 years, we've had the same 2 writing teams producing those new productions. Finn Anderson, who needs no introduction, I think. We've interviewed him several times here on Musical Talk, and he's a well-known force in British musical theatre writing. And the other team comprises Jonathan Bauerfeld and Kendall, 2 American writers who are as charming as they are talented, which is to say, very in both cases. And we'll be able to hear an interview with them in next week's episode. But for this week, we're going to hear a conversation I had with the perennially excellent Michael Gordon Shapiro, a composer in his own right, as we spoke about the 3 shows at the Royal Scottish Conservatoire put on for us last year at the 2019 Edinburgh Festival Fringe. That's Legally Blonde, Limbo the 12 and Limbo City of Dreams. And we'll go into that conversation with a song from the 12 by Jonathan Bauerfeld and Kendall called Sleeping Dogs.
If Tess were here, what would she say? I think she'd argue it was better this way. Of course it's a tragedy, of course it's a crime, of course nobody here wants anyone to die. But maybe she's better off, and maybe it's time. Maybe it's better to let sleeping dogs lie.
Maybe it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. Maybe it's better to watch her just fade away.
I was at a funeral for an addict once, and everyone was thinking the same 2 things. If only things could have been different, and thank God it's finally over. Look at these papers, this mess. I wish things had gone different for Tess, but they didn't, and now it's done. She's found her peace. If Tess were here,
bless her,
what would she say?
The pain she was in,
I think she'd argue
it was better this way.
It was better.
Of course it's a tragedy, of course it's a crime. Of course nobody here wants anyone to die.
But maybe she's better off, and maybe it's time.
Maybe it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. Maybe it's better to not ask ourselves why. Maybe it's better to watch her just fade away.
Tess and I shared clothes a lot growing up. Then I noticed that I hadn't seen my hoodie for a few months. I thought I had just lost it, but I was walking through the Urban Exchange down on Pacific and boom, there it was. The last gift Dad gave me before he died, and she sold it.
It's better this way.
It's better this way. It's better this way.
It's better. What's done is
It's better this way. Thank God
Mike, as always, a real delight to speak to you. I've now noticed that you and I now speak in places across the world. We've spoken by internet telephone, shall we say, with you in America and me in Britain. We've met in Scotland, and this time we're meeting in London. But in a way, the location has nothing to do with the quality of the conversation, because it's always interesting to talk to you. And this time we are continuing our odyssey of the 2019 Edinburgh Festival Fringe, which we've both now completed, as it were, with our little badges and medals on.
Indeed, and it's always a pleasure to chat with you about our shared experiences. And I would like to point out that since the listeners don't have any particular evidence of where we are, we could continue the tradition in our imagination and next time say that here we are in the Netherlands, here we are in Thule, Antarctica. We could be wherever we like, and they won't be any the wiser.
Well, welcome from Jupiter.
Exactly. I probably shouldn't have recorded this part, so don't forget to delete it afterwards.
I might actually just put that in and say welcome from Thule. Now, we have a tradition of talking about the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, but there is also another tradition at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe that we like to talk about, and that is the Royal Scottish Conservatoire's offerings. In the last few years, that seems to have settled down in a particular pattern of a big Broadway show, and then two newly commissioned pieces, thematically linked, sometimes quite loosely, but with that subtitle in there, title of the show. One in the Scottish tradition, and one from an American university, and both being performed on alternate days in Edinburgh. This year we had Legally Blonde as the big Broadway show, a well-known show of many years standing, came to London a few years ago. Nick Hudson of this parish dragged me to it because he just wanted to see how I would react to it. And we'll talk how I reacted and how I reacted again when I saw it in Edinburgh in just a minute. But also the two new writing, I think, is one of the great gifts that the Royal Scottish Conservatoire gives to the Edinburgh Fringe every year. Whatever one thinks of them, they're always, I think, sort of must-sees. They're always excellent professionally. They've always give one food for thought. This year they were called Limbo.
I think that was the unifying theme of both shows.
That's right. Limbo The 12 and Limbo City of Dreams. And between us, we saw all three, and we certainly saw the new commissions, and very different they were too. But I thought we might start with what might be called the showstopper, which is Legally Blonde. I mean, you didn't see it in Edinburgh this year, but you do know the piece.
I do know it fairly well, and I've seen production previously.
What's your hot take on it then, if I were to ask you?
I may shock you, but I have a lot of admiration for Legally Blonde. Despite not sitting in the target demographic of the audience, it is very much a kind of gaudy, fun, fairly broad show in many respects. The music is unabashed pop, and I don't mean to imply that's bad. I'm just saying it's very commercially oriented. It's based on a popular film. But despite it being a little bit... There's a kind of metaphor I draw between the main character of the show and the show itself, because it seems like it's shallow, but it's actually not. It's actually fairly smart and clever and has a legitimately good message. And there's some kind of erudite intellectual content, too, especially around the law school part of the story. So despite the fact that it is a little bit garish, musically and perhaps story-wise, I enjoy it and think it's a well-written show.
Now, I'm not going to disagree with very much you've said there, but I do think I have to park a certain amount of my disbelief in a car park some way away before I can really enjoy it. What I discover both times on seeing it, the London production a few years ago and again in Edinburgh, is that if I take it as a cartoon, I find it very entertaining. And that's exactly what I have to do. Now, I go in, because I had forgotten all the detail, I went in again with great eagerness to see this very successful show, and I very quickly remembered that garish is a very good term. It is raucous. It's particularly raucous at the beginning. I find the first couple... I remember this very clearly from seeing the London production. The sorority scenes at the beginning, the all-female university living areas, were screechy. And I think it was the way they'd been directed to perform originally. The Edinburgh version was less screechy, but it was still very raucous. And then the plot starts, and then I'm absolutely fine. So if I take out the first 10 minutes, I'm absolutely okay. About 20 minutes in, I suddenly realise that the psychology's all wrong, so I park that, and then it becomes a cartoon, and then I enjoy it. And it is the psychology I want to explain my thoughts on, and I'd be interested to hear your view. In the programme, because it's a professional production, the Royal Scottish Conservatoire are kind enough to give you a programme for the three shows, I noticed that the director had tried to badge Legally Blonde as a Me Too feminist musical. Now, it's perfectly fine, and it has a cartoon feminist message, but I don't think it has a real feminist message. And I think stapling it to the Me Too situation at the moment feels a little bit bandwagon jumping, if I may be honest. And the reason for this is that Elle, the central character, does confound our expectations as she does within the piece. She appears to be not brainless, because she is actually at university studying makeup marketing or something like that. I can't remember what it was. And she then decides that for the purposes of the plot to stay in with her ex-boyfriend. I mean, the intent is all wrong. That she's going to enroll at Harvard Law School, which is a very prestigious American university.
It is, yeah.
Possibly one of the most, certainly worldwide reputation. And she successfully does so. So she is a bright cookie. And so that particular gaffe is blown fairly early on. You know, we see that she's intelligent. It pretends to carry on playing that line that even at Harvard, people are judging her on the way she looks, even though she must have been good to get there. It's certainly true that she seems to take her foot off the pedal a bit every time she's anywhere near her ex. But eventually she gets over that by finding true love with a character whose name I think is Emmett. They both then sing this song about being outsiders, which is called A Chip on Your Shoulder or something like that. You know, they need that little flame of anger or bitterness that life hasn't dealt them quite the same privileges as other people in order to fight their way to the top. Perfectly reasonable. I like that. And then the time that she hits her first bit of real jeopardy, which is basically when her university lecturer makes a pass at her, she goes completely to pieces. And she decides that she is at fault, and she packs her bag and she's ready to go home. Instead of saying, hang on a minute, this is an abuse of the because he's still her teacher, he's picked her for his team to work on a court case they've got. But he is still her teacher. The relationship between a lecturer and student is clearly delineated by all manner of laws and morality. And yet, instead of reporting him, she decides that the fault is hers and she's going to go home. Then all the people that she respects in the Harvard environment, whether they be Emmett or even her hairdresser, say, don't do it, you know, fight your course. And she says, no, I'm going to leave. In fact, there's this terrible scene where it's already clear that Emmett and she are in love, and Emmett sings this song to her, and she just sings over about how she is going to go home. And then the reason she changes her mind is because her ex's own ex, who's a bitter rival, comes around and says, no, you mustn't let the system get you down, sister. And the problem is, it doesn't feel true at all, and that's what changes her mind. So she needs the validation of her enemy and rival, rather than her friends, to overcome her immediate insecurity, which to fight something that is actually her reaction to what happened seemed false within the context of her actually being quite a go-getting character with a lot of agency and brains. So for me, that's why psychologically it makes no sense whatsoever. But if I park that to one side, I can then go with what I call the sentiment-only approach, which is what we've got here, which is actually that we're given narrative beats which we are supposed to recognise as being good story beats, even if they're not good psychological story beats. Does that make any kind of sense?
It does, and I agree with the point you're making, which I hadn't really thought about previously, that the pivot at the end doesn't seem to follow the trajectory that Elle was on previously, where she had, I think, the end of Act 1, this moment of self-actualization and realization that her self-esteem is not contingent on the approval of her former boyfriend, and that she's going to be her own person, and then subsequent to that, she achieves both an impressive and amusing courtroom victory.
She does.
So perhaps we think, well, by this point, she should be pretty well rooted in her newly acquired self-esteem. Why is she being knocked off the path? I feel like Elle Woods herself is on trial right now, and we are acting like lawyers. In her defense, I will say that the professor figure,
who's the bad teacher,
the one who ultimately reveals himself to be of low character, he was instrumental towards her achieving this new self-esteem. He was her mentor, and he provided the opportunities. He put her on the battleground and allowed her opportunity to succeed. So I can imagine that finding the same person who enabled her, turning around and dismissing her, could be psychologically catastrophic. I'm a little more sympathetic on that particular point of the ones that you mentioned.
Well, this is why you're a better person than I am, Mike, morally as well as intellectually, I'm sure. But I will counter that, if I may, by saying that, yes, I suppose you could argue that he's her mentor in some senses. He does give her opportunities, and he recognises in her that she has enough intellectual and legal savvy to be useful. But actually, his form of mentoring is very abrasive and negative. It's actually knock you down to build you up. So that's not a kind of mentoring method of which I approve. So yes, he is an enabler, but he's also an enabler through being a bully, through being negative, by knocking people down and rebuilding them in his own image, or at least that seems to be the process. I question whether that's real mentoring, but I accept the point that actually if he's an enabler for her improvement, self-improvement, then yes, I can see that might be a harder thing to deal with. I still don't buy that, having had a pass made at her, that she wouldn't immediately go to the authorities and say, this teacher has done something terrible. But there we are. But as I say, I parked all that. And I really did. And by parking it, I really enjoyed the show. And I think, agree with you, after I'm through the first 5 minutes of Screeching, I enjoyed all the songs, I enjoyed the performances. I think that as a cartoon, it makes a great deal of sense. There is a slight problem with the end. I mean, she persuades the defendant in the trial, who is a very particular person and is cut from a very similar cloth in terms of wishing to control how she is perceived as Elle, and they strike up a kind of symbiosis and friendship, and therefore the defendant sacks the professor from Harvard and takes on Elle individually as to run her court case with Emmett, and wins, but wins because of extracurricular knowledge. Very little legal knowledge is needed to know about putting perms into showers.
Right.
In my view, unless the Crown versus Vidal Sassoon ever came to trial, I don't think that's necessarily made it onto the books. And it's then suggested that this was the beginning of her glorious career, and you think, well, I just hope that she gets an awful lot of makeup-related cases, because it is true that she knows her law and she's actually been very successful, but actually the clinching thing was the Sherlock Holmes moment rather than a legal moment. So she made a deduction from an area that she knew rather than actually won it on a legal basis. However, I'm quibbling because once again, if this was being played for real, I would find all that terrible. But because I'm immediately being told this is garish, raucous, slightly heightened, but actually I can get onto the roller coaster cartoon and get there to the very end. So it sounds like I'm being negative, and I'm not, but I did want to pick up those reasons why I had to treat this in a particular way to enjoy it, rather than just sitting down and enjoying it.
Sure, you're seeing it as a smart cartoon rather than putting it on the same plane as a higher work of art with more psychological depth.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
There's one element to this that I particularly enjoyed, a kind of karmic causality throughout this show. I like it in musicals when a character does the right thing, and then as a side effect of doing the right thing, there's some other benefit conferred into their life. And in this case, it was her befriending the hairdresser.
Oh, yes.
And taking on her case pro bono, which had the effect of confirming to Elle her own sense of efficacy as a lawyer. I think that was her, I really want to do this, I can do this moment, which gave her the courage to take on the case subsequently. But also, if I remember correctly, the hairdresser gave a vital piece of information that was key to Elle discrediting one witness, so that Elle's act of kindness redounded back upon her and gave her a tool she needed to succeed in her main mission.
It's an altruism accumulator, I think, is sort of where you're going with that.
I haven't heard that term, but that sounds about right.
Well, I've just coined it, that's why, but yes.
I'm proud to have been here for the moment. I'm curious.
Listen up, future, that's where it started.
And we have recorded evidence. There's one song in the cast album and that I saw when I saw the show, and I'm curious if it was changed or removed, given that it was playing in the UK, and I think the title is Gay or European.
Oh no, it was definitely there and got many, many laughs.
Okay, great. I was curious about that.
But it's interesting because it obviously Britain is a European country, and well, I suppose we've got a foot in both camps in a sense. Obviously, our connection with American culture and our connection with European culture are both profound and both historic, and in different areas we veer in different directions. But the song played very well. It also, it was a good musical theatre audience there, so the demographic was also, I think I can guarantee there were many gay men and women in the audience that day, seemingly enjoying it. I was with some friends who are gay. They were definitely enjoying it. And it's interesting you raise that question, because were we enjoying it for what it was, or were we enjoying it through the prism of knowing what we still think, I have to say here in Britain and on the continent, of, and I hope you won't mind me making this observation, American Puritanism, which still runs deep in the American psyche, or still seems to. So a kind of loose freeness, which I think was being identified as being a European tradition, sexually or otherwise, in dress sense as well, and just carrying oneself, seems to be a much more... It's something that we believe that the Americans care about more than we do. That makes any kind of sense. So the song was enjoyed, but I think it was enjoyed through a prism rather than directly. And I hope I haven't offended anyone with my terrible, terrible generalisations about culture, but I am using shorthand here.
Of course. No,
as the piece itself does.
It's funny because of both the analogy, but also thinking, yes, that's how they would view the situation.
Yeah.
They would have trouble culturally differentiating between eccentric heterosexual garb from perhaps Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
or what might be considered homosexual flamboyant garb. And to them, they're confused. It's funny for us to look through their eyes and see that confusion and see how that bears in the plot.
Funnily enough, I have a real-life example of that between Britain and France. A gay friend of mine went over to France a few years ago and thought there were many more gay men around, but it just turns out that what he identifies as a gay haircut was a much more standard haircut in France at that time, and therefore all the cues were wrong for him. So, just small cultural cues like that are difficult to interpret, almost between nations, let alone between continents. So, yes, no, the song was there and vastly enjoyed. It would have been interesting. I mean, obviously it's plot important that the character is gay, but it might have been interesting if it turns out that he wasn't. But of course, it wasn't really an investigation on that. It was actually Elle spotting that the character was gay when her sort of stick-in-the-mud professor couldn't.
And that tied into her expertise because she was a fashion whiz.
Yes.
That was her own. That was the unique thing she was bringing to the table.
It's her extracurricular knowledge helped her particularly in this case, but I would like to see her in a different case.
Yeah, let's hear your take on a murder trial.
Yeah, quite.
I think the implication was she's generally smart and capable.
Yes.
And perhaps having a case that combines her new legal knowledge with her pre-existing expertise gave her a gentle bridge from one world to the other. But
also, I think there's a more general term, actually, as well, a general point to be made, which is, although her outsider knowledge was seemingly particular, you could argue that actually being the outsider gives her a fresher view. And as it happens, it's all about hair, tongs and makeup, but just being an outsider like Emmett is gives them a non-stifled, trammelled way of looking at legal cases, which is actually useful in real life, because law is still about real life, even if it's so easy to make it think it's to come to the conclusion it's all about John Grisham novels.
indeed, there's a statement against the entrenchment of the, what's the word I'm looking for, the established powers,
Yes.
I guess, and that it's good to shake things up a little bit. And boy, is that what this show is about.
Yeah.
What did you think? We've been talking about the show in abstract mostly. What did you think about the particular production?
Well, it's interesting because elsewhere you and I have had a conversation about Sweet Charity and how important it is that you have the right person playing charity because it sits so heavily on their shoulders. We have a very similar situation here. You know, the central character is a female and an endearing female who also has a journey, even in a cartoon sense, but she has a journey. And therefore you need a very capable actress to carry that off. You need to be capable and appealing. You need to be able to engage. And the actress that they asked to play Elle absolutely succeeded in that, in my view. You know, we bought into her very quickly. And she carries the piece, of course, because it is Elle's journey. Everything else is incidental to that. So I was pleased with the production. There were a lot of cameo parts, and therefore there were various people doing
Multiple roles.
multiple roles, particularly as they hadn't been given a main role, so their sort of compensation was lots of smaller roles. It is easy to, particularly within the context of the tone of that piece, to ham them up a little. But that doesn't necessarily work against the production. So the actor who played the Irish postman that the hairdresser eventually links up with, I won't say he was hamming it up, but he was certainly making sure that his moment was spotted. But to great acclaim from the audience. They loved the fact that he sort of swanned on in a very kind of sexually knowing way and flaunted his stuff, I suppose.
Right on.
Yes, it gave us a shot of his male bag, in fact.
That was a great pun. I just have to take a moment to appreciate it. Mailbag. Yeah. So it sounds like they did a hearty job of embodying the characters without pushing them to the point of caricature.
Yes, I think that's fair. They were able. It seems silly, really, to say this, but yes, they were able to explore them, exploit them, but not over-egg them. So they withdrew from grotesquerie. So yes, absolutely. I think it's. They were real within the context of the piece that we were being offered. How real that allows them to be, of course, because, as I say, you have to take out so many of the structural supports of reality to make the piece work, I think. But within that context, once I was in the cartoon, they worked very nicely in the cartoon, and they were not bigger than the cartoon they were in. How's that?
That makes sense to me.
Well, that's Legally Blonde, and it was a great show. But now I know how to deal with it. I can very happily see it again. But it's taken me 2 viewings.
You had to set up a framework under which you could enjoy the show and set your expectations accordingly.
That's exactly right, yeah. In London, I don't think I was suitably equipped to spot what I needed to do to enjoy it properly. But the Royal Scottish Conservatoire is nothing if not varied, because to balance Legally Blonde and its very particular take on musical theatre, we did have these 2 brand new writing commissions, The 12 and City of Dreams, linked by this term Limbo. Now, we both saw them, but not together.
Correct.
Which would you like to talk about first?
I thought Limbo the 12 was the stronger of the 2, though I have many good things to say about both. And it was very interesting to me in terms of structure, so maybe we can jump in there.
Well, let us do so then. Do you want to? I've done a lot of talking about Legally Blonde, so I would be very interested to hear your take on Limbo the 12. And I will, by the way, just immediately say I agree. I think of the 2, it was the stronger piece. But of course, it's also more constrained, but therefore enhanced by the format it was in, which is exactly what you were sort of alluding to, I think.
I think both pieces had enormous strengths, and I emotionally was engaged by both of them. But we'll start in discussing the 12. The overarching description would be that we see a heroin addict apparently dying alone in an alley from an overdose. And we are immediately whisked away to a supernatural environment, and I think this was their interpretation of Limbo,
Yep.
Wherein 12 people who are in some way connected to the addict, whose name is Thos, have been gathered in an ambiguously supernatural way.
A celestial courtroom, perhaps.
Exactly.
Or jury room, in fact, yes.
What I called it was Magic 12 Angry Men, because they're all present and they're assigned a task by 2 supernatural bailiffs, it appears, and that is to decide whether Thos is to be given another chance at life, if she's going to be resuscitated from her apparent overdose, or if she's going to be allowed to peacefully pass to the hereafter. And the rules are that there must be a unanimous yes verdict in order for her to have the second chance at life. If there's a hung jury, or if there's a unanimous no, she dies. And at the outset of the show, almost everyone is ready to vote no and to say that Thos should be allowed to die. And this is startling because even though we are at the outset of the show just learning who these people are, it seems there are people who should have a very close relationship to Thos, including her mother.
Yes.
So for all of them to be almost united in their decision to let her die is a little bit startling. So it starts the show off in a very interesting point intellectually. It engages our curiosity. What has this girl done that has so alienated her from the sympathy of the various people in her life? I should elaborate that the people present play different roles in her life, and we only, as the show goes on, learn to the extent of their connection.
Some are very trivial and some are very significant.
Seemingly so.
Yeah.
There is someone at the outset who says, I don't know this woman at all. I'm not qualified to judge her. I believe that's the first person who does not give a no verdict. So that's the premise of the show. And during the show, we hear descriptions of Tess's life. We see segments of her life dramatized. We see Thos come onto stage and reenact her past.
Flashbacks, as it were.
Exactly. That's what happens. And slowly we get a sense of who she is, and our opinion of whether or not she should be given another chance inexorably shifts, which I think is the intent of the show. I will stop short of saying how it ends, but I will say that the tide does turn. And I'll also say that even though things seem to be going well for her towards the end, even though more and more people are being brought to sympathize with her, to her side, there are still some very strong arguments from people very close to her why that she's a lost case and should not be subjected to the pain of life. I think it's a very compassionate point of view. It's not harsh condemnation. The view against letting her live tends to be, she was in such pain, she destroyed herself so thoroughly, it would be a cruelty to bring her back. Let's not do that. So it's not a straw man where we think someone's being unreasonably harsh and we're just waiting for their heart to thaw. there really is an interesting debate on the merits of giving her a second chance.
I agree with that. I would say there's in a few cases, particularly in the entrenched cases, sometimes it's from a position of wider experience and prejudice. For example, there's a policeman who spent most of his time picking up drug addicts and seeing the crime they commit and the unhappiness they cause, and he's sort of become embittered by that, and therefore I don't think it's Tess he's against. I think it's almost all drug addicts. So in his case, he has an understandable prejudice or position on drug users. So it's much less about the personal and much more about the wider problem. But in some cases, there's also it's not just it would be a cruelty to let her live because of the sadness that she has in her life and the unhappiness she has in her life. It's the unhappiness she's brought to others. So there's the relationship with the mother is explored in those terms, and the mother is desperately hurt because of the actions of Tess. So it's not just it would be cruel to let Tess live. It is let us not forget the pain that she has caused us. There is an interesting thing, I think, with the Tess character, however, which is I think this is actually the point of the writing. It is very easy for us as audience members, and in some sense, and I said this to the authors when I met them, we are the 13th member of the jury. Because, as you say, we have to investigate through the information being given to us what our opinion of Tess is, to see if we concur with the view of the celestial jury before us. But it is very easy to fall into the trap, as we all do, of saying drug addicts are like this, and they do this, and therefore we judge them in the same way. You dehumanise the individual and label them as drug addicts or criminals, however you want to do so. And I think we all do that naturally. We know that's the way society works. The press will always report drug addicts in a negative way. There's very little humanity in any reporting. So I think that we go into this thinking, oh, well, she's quickly established as a drug addict. There she is dying in front of us from an overdose. As you say, slumped against the table. We have to have our opinions turned, or at least address our own thoughts about what it is that she is and who it is that she is. And I think those are two very different things. She becomes an individual to us through the retelling of her stories. And what I find very striking and powerful is the fact that actually you do get a very well drawn view of all the aspects of who she is. So she's not even, she's not a one-note character. It'd be very easy to write this as Tess, the drug addict who did this, and even if she had a redeeming feature, she was a drug addict with this redeeming feature, but she isn't. What she actually turns out to be is this multifaceted character. You see her in the very early days of her addiction, you see her in the middle of her addiction, you see her at the end of her addiction. You learn about parts of her youth before her addiction. Don't always see them, but you're given a kaleidoscopic picture of who she turns out to be and all those different parts of who she is, which we all have, of course. We all are more than one person. And that immediately humanises her, it immediately individualises her, and Tess becomes a living person in front of us. So ironically, there's this traverse trajectory that as we start the show with her dying, or on the cusp of death, she sort of comes to life over the course of the production to us as the 13th jury member. I'm probably labouring this terribly, but I found that very powerful. But the other thing I spotted is that Tess appears to have a great deal of agency, more agency than I would expect for a traditional drug addict in fiction. I think that's the strength of the writing rather than the weakness of the writing. So in those realisations of her being a real person, you see her commit acts of kindness as well as acts of badness. So she's when she finds herself in rehab with another drug addict who then actually goes on to die, but is still at the celestial jury, we learn that it was the kindness of Tess to this person whose first time it was in rehab which actually helped them during the rehab period. So there's once again humanity. Kindness is an aspect of that. So I was very much taken by the fact that our initial prejudices, which we've all got, were turned on their heads very successfully through a well-written and well-performed piece of drama.
We are swept along with the jury in revising our opinion of Tess as we learned who she was and why she became addicted and what her actions were when she was addicted. And in one case, there's a erroneous assumption about her actions, her involvement in a friend's becoming an addict, not becoming an addict, but a friend experiences a bad drug overdose. And Tess is initially impugned to be the villain in that scenario, and it turns out that's not the case. So it's a combination of actively showing us who she is and then correcting a few misinterpretations and giving us context about the source of her addiction, which fleshes her out as a person. And just as the jury slowly is swayed in her favor, so are we, which I thought was so interesting. Emotionally, this show really hit me, and it did so by degrees, because I went in almost resenting it. I thought, here's a show that's going to take somebody of no merit who's destroyed their life and then spin a sob story about it wasn't their fault, and at the end we're supposed to be crying. I don't like that at all. That's, of course, what the jury was feeling. And as the show went on and her life was illustrated to us, I completely came around about my feelings of the main character, and then, of course, my emotional response to the show. So by the end, I was choked up, and I'm going to reveal the ending, because it's not as obvious as you all might think from our description. So there's some mystery here, but I was very moved by the ending. And I think that there's a kind of expertise in the writing that allows us to take that journey along with the jury in the show.
Now, this is an interesting thing about the format, because it is, exactly as you said, magic 12 Angry Men, and I was lucky enough to discuss it with Jonathan Bauerfeld and Casey Kendall, the composer and the writer. And Casey, who's the writer, said he loves 12 Angry Men. It's one of his favourite films. He said it absolutely is borrowed format, in a format sense, from that film. And we've all seen trial films, we've read trial books. It's a very traditional form of drama because it's adversarial, essentially. The trial is. The jury can also be adversarial, as 12 Angry Men shows. And that's a proper trope in literature and culture anyway, the film and the book. In fact, I can think of a sitcom in the 1950s on British television which did its own version of 12 Angry Men, but with an incompetent in the Henry Fonda role. It was immediately striking. It still remains striking. But it is a format. There's only so much you can do with a jury situation. So the story itself of the individual has to be strong or well done or well revealed or cleverly revealed, and I think all of those are true here. But do you think that format, I suppose the question I'm coming around to is actually, when is a format stifling and when is a format actually a catalyst for creativity, as it was here?
I think in this case they came upon a very interesting, I don't want to say bending of the rules of traditional musical theater, but an interesting extension of those rules. And I don't mean rules as in the written in a law book. I mean the kind of patterns that successful shows have adopted in the past. In a traditional musical, certainly of the Broadway variety, we are introduced to the main character immediately, and we immediately know who they are. They are well defined from the get-go, and
with an ambition.
With an ambition, some kind of unwavering want, as my mentor would have said, some kind of goal, and their personality is super clear from the outset. Elle Woods, for example, we really know who she is the second we meet her. She's spunky, she's irreverent, she's immersed in sorority culture, she's got an eye for fashion, and she is utterly devoted to her boyfriend. And we know this about her. There's no figuring her out. It's not like in a straight play where there's often a tradition of the onion peel where you're learning someone bit by bit and there's some shocking revelation, which is almost always a pregnancy at the end. But in this case, in this show, the protagonist is defined very gradually over time. And in fact, instead of being asked to sympathize with the protagonist at the get-go, as in Legally Blonde, the question of whether or not we sympathize with her is in fact the plot. And the conclusion we reach on that question is really the essence of the story, because if she is exonerated by this magic trial, then we'll connect to her. We like her because we find some merit in her situation. And it's interesting to me that they've managed to make a show where the sympathy for the protagonist is earned slowly over time. I think as a side effect of this, as a postscript, I didn't like her at the beginning because I didn't know her by design. And I didn't have that initial sense that I do with many musicals of, got it, that's the main character, I'm aboard, they want to be a professional plumber, I'm going to cheer them on as they go to plumber school or whatever it is. Oh, and another point related to this, there's no overwhelming goal that the main character has, not even to stay alive. Because as we see Tess at the beginning, she seems mostly befuddled by the supernatural trial.
She is allowed to observe the supernatural trial. I think that's the point we haven't actually clarified. Yes. So we see her on the cusp of death, and then the trial starts, and she, as you said, these bailiffs aren't just running the jury's arrangement, but they are keeping her from engaging with any of the characters. So she's not allowed to plead or make statement. It's not a court, it's a jury.
Exactly. And she has apparently no agency at the beginning, which also seems like a big violation of the rules of musical theater, because how can you like a character who can't do anything? Elle Woods, at the beginning of her story, decides to crazily go to Harvard Law. That's a big action. In this show, Tess can't take any big actions.
She's legally dead.
She's legally dead. Well done. I can't build upon that. Perfect joke. So how do we like her? What are we going to have to wait to the end of the show to actually feel some emotional connection to the main character? And what's so interesting here is that even though present-day Tess in Limbo has no agency, or apparently has no agency, as we see her revealed in the past through these anecdotes, we see her take decisive action. So over time, she becomes retroactively an active character with a goal in the past, and we start to like her because we see her pursue certain ends.
It's very, very clever, isn't it? And it's interesting, just having that conversation has also just drawn a fact to me which I don't think I've ever quite seen before. And it's just a format issue actually here, that courts, a courtroom scene is about revealing, ultimately builds up to a fact, or a set of facts. So you're a revelation of a factual story, whereas a jury is about, at least in this case, is about investigating the individual. So, and obviously in a trial story you would possibly have both. But very often, actually, the way trial stories are represented is that the jury goes off and we don't see their deliberations and then they come back and make their judgment. Here we don't see the court scene, because there isn't one, but we are getting the investigation into the individual, the defendant in this case.
Indeed, and in fact, there are some courtroom-like aspects to this deliberation, because we are seeing new evidence, we are seeing testimony revisited at one point, all through flashbacks and occasionally descriptions of the past. To that point, what I think is very interesting is I really felt engaged in this show once the dramatized flashbacks begun.
Yes.
One of the first bits of testimony, it's probably not the right term because it's a jury deliberation, but the first account that is given is by Tess's her ex, who is describing the difficulties that their relationship suffered during Tess's on and off again addiction. And this is told entirely from the perspective of her ex. We're not seeing the past dramatized. It's an assertion of what happened. And I didn't find this very effective dramatically, because it was somebody telling me about something I haven't seen, and it pertained to a character I didn't really understand. So I kind of zoned out at this point. It was a pretty song, and the performance was lovely, but it wasn't engaging to me dramatically. In contrast, one of the...
Because it's reported action rather than action.
Exactly right, and that never works. Though in this story, I think it's appropriate to begin with a weak defense, because we want the defensive Tess to become increasingly powerful. But shortly after that, there was a narrative, a flashback, a dramatized flashback, where I believe you alluded to this. Tess is in a rehab center, which is not the greatest place in the world to be, and she's with a newly admitted drug addict, or someone who underwent self-harm or was there for some reason, and Tess is trying to cheer her up, and she does it by a satirical celebration of the rehab center called Heroin Hotel.
Yes.
Which is a hysterical song. She's basically describing both the dingy trappings of the hotel as if it were a promotion or an ad for the hotel, and she's including a very candid assessment of why they're both there. And not only is it a really funny song, it's purposeful because Tess is singing this as an act of compassion. She's trying to cheer up someone who seems to be very desolate. And that bears upon the central plot, because we're here to determine, is Tess a good person? Here's some evidence that she was. Also, it's a really funny song.
Can I also say that she doesn't break character to do it either, because she remains sardonic in her delivery, which is entirely right. She's sort of resigned to it and can see the gallows funny side of the circumstances. So she's not suddenly a clown and full of lightness and happiness. She is finding the humour through the gritted teeth of the grim reality, if you like. So I like that sardonic approach that she has in that song.
It really defines her character.
Yes, I think so.
More than anything else, because we haven't seen a lot of her at that point, and we haven't seen her really do anything active. I don't remember if this episode follows the one where she corrects our misinformation about her involvement in a friend's overdose, but it either followed right after it or preceded it. But this is one of our first impressions of Tess as a person. And right after that song, I thought, I have a sense of who she is. I like her. I just saw her do something. She's really funny. Didn't hurt that it was a great song. I'm on her side now, or at least I'm willing to be on her side. And that's when I first became engaged in the show.
Now, I've got two further questions I'd like to ask you. One does involve a plot point, so if people don't want to hear this, they might want to fast forward for a few minutes. But there are very strict rules by which Tess is able to watch. She's not allowed to engage with anyone, and then towards the very end, she sort of gets past the warders, if you like, and does engage with one of the people around the table. So the rules are broken. And it turns out that's a clincher. Could it have been done in a different way? Should it have been done the way it was? I mean, I appreciate these are entirely subjective questions, but the end, whatever it is achieved by her breaking the rules of the situation as set up, which does give us a dramatic ending, or at least a dramatic pivot to make the ending. So I understand why it's there, but there is always a slight dissatisfaction that actually success has come by breaking the rules, the James T. Kirk approach.
This is what I call the defending your life moment, because there is a parallel between the climax of this story and Defending Your Life, the Albert Brooks movie, in that it's a limbo environment. Actually, there are a couple of parallels, because both characters are in limbo and they're being evaluated, and the results of the evaluation of their character will determine whether they get to go on to somewhere better.
Yeah.
And in both cases, there's a defiance of the rules that are very clearly established, and that act of defiance becomes important. I also felt that initial reluctance that you're describing, that I don't know if it's a resentment, but a kind of feeling that it's disappointing, because our acceptance of a supernatural story hinges on our understanding the rules of the world and understanding the characters are constrained by that. So when somebody breaks those rules, you think, oh, really? They're going to betray their own plot? But I think both here and in the movie Defending Your Life, it is vitally important that the character take action in the here and now for them to be a protagonist or a hero or someone we can admire. And all of Tess's action in the show previously is in the past. And I think to really bring home the story, she needs to do something in the present, and this is a good opportunity for her to do something that shows strength of character as well as defiance of our expectations of what is possible. So I came around to that decision and ended up liking it.
And my second question is, how do you define the limbo in which they're in? What is that celestial courtroom?
Well, we can interpret it as is, metaphysically. We can say in the world of this show, there is an afterlife, or at least an intermediate afterlife.
A limbo, in fact, yes, as you say.
But it could also be rationalized as taking place in Tessa's mind during those few final seconds where she's going to live or die, and instead of being granted life by supernatural bailiffs, maybe the real stakes are whether she's going to rouse herself to consciousness and fight on. Is she going to let slip the reins of her existence, or is she going to redouble her effort to come back to life? So this could be justified in a very realistic way, at least realistic by musical theater standards, as all taking place in her mind, and I would have accepted that just as easily.
Well, it's interesting you should say that.
You've had a chat with the creators, so maybe you have some light to share on this.
I do indeed, and that's the very point I'm coming to. I took it at face value when I saw it as a celestial court that had somehow been summoned into existence. A hitherto unexplained element of the afterlife, if you like. I bought into that immediately. That was perfectly fine. I didn't have any trouble with that. That is the conceit of the piece. I'm in, off we go. It didn't even dawn on me that it might be the last flutterings of Tess's mind, where she has put herself on trial, or at least is conducting an inquiry into her own life, and therefore, as you say, galvanising herself or not to die or not die. When I spoke to Jonathan and Casey explained to me that the way they have rationalised it to themselves is your second option, that it is her, I won't say on her deathbed, but at the point of death, trying herself, judging herself as to whether or not she should go on and whether she can be forgiven or could not be forgiven. And that's very interesting, because I read it at face value and not in what might be termed the realistic approach. I don't think it damaged that in any way, because I still loved it. But when Casey told me that, I was genuinely surprised, because I just hadn't factored that in. And it's interesting that you had factored that in as a possibility, and it's not made any difference to either of our appreciations of its very excellent piece.
I don't think it truly matters. A question arises in the case of the imaginary trial scenario. How did she conjure up the character of the concierge who finds her body and discovers a detail about her. Is that character from the real world? Was she vaguely or dimly aware of that real world person and incorporated him into her fantasy? How would she have knowledge of that person's existence if she was in fact ODing at that moment? That's a small little plot question we might ask.
Although conversely, it is possible to argue that she must have known that if she were to die, her body would be found. And therefore she is projecting a character onto an avatar that she knows must exist in this story.
So she synthesized a likely person.
Yeah.
This doesn't truly matter in the long run, but it's a fun thing to think about.
But particularly as that character then turns out to be the trigger for the entire debate.
Yes, exactly right. Alternatively, if it is a universe where Tess has a second chance and a celestial deliberative body, does everybody get that chance in this universe? Do people who are even more noble than Tess have that same opportunity? And if so, why does death exist? So whichever way you go, it's possible to overthink it.
I think perhaps you've got into bigger questions.
Yes, but I don't think this doesn't really bear upon the enjoyment of the show, which is pretty strong, regardless of which of these two interpretations you take.
I love the show. I do just briefly want to pay tribute to the score, though, because we've been talking about the intricacies of the plot, and quite rightly so. But I also think that the score meshes perfectly with what we're getting and is varied. You know, this is quite a down story for most of the time. You know, the death of a character, the pain that she's caused herself, the pain she's caused others, the judgment on those failings that she has, and she undoubtedly does have, could allow us a very dark, miserable piece. And it's quite right that there are moments when that is reflected, but as you say, there's Heroin Hotel, which is a brighter, lighter piece, entirely in keeping with what we've got. I found the score nicely varied, nicely appropriate. So I think it is a great fusion of score and book.
I agree. I found it mature and accessible, contemporary, but not a pastiche of any particular contemporary style. There was, as you said, a lot of emotional variety. I especially appreciated that Heroin Hotel is a functional song in the story. It wasn't just a throwaway moment that was funny to give us a little bit of relief from the grim subject matter. I also was very impressed by the song that represented the strongest case against Tess, which was the mother's case, where she had exposition about her own experiences, which were heartbreaking, which brought to light the damage that addicts do to those closest to them, and really was a powerful song in its own right. But again, instead of just being a strong declamatory lament, it bore directly on the story.
Yes.
So the songs were functional. They all meant something within the context of what was being told to us, so we could enjoy them both as art, both as music, as well as part of the plot. And that, to me, is the art of musical storytelling.
They certainly serve the narrative, yes.
Across the
Very
board,
much, yeah.
with no exception. They all have that kind of functionality.
So Limbo the 12, a palpable hit.
I think it was probably the best show that I saw at the Fringe this year.
Now, I find it ironic that its sister piece has the title it does, given the fact that it is possible to interpret Limbo the 12 as her having her final dream in the city in which she's dying, when in fact the next show is called Limbo, City of Dreams. Entirely different, completely unrelated, and not really an urban musical at all with the word city in it. Sold to us much more as a kind of fairy tale story.
Modern myth.
Yes, myth is a good description of it. Would you care to have a crack at describing that one?
Sure.
And we should say this is the 12 was the, if you like, the American one. The Scottish one by Finn Anderson here, who I believe once again wrote the book as well as the score.
And was he responsible for any of the musicals previously presented by the Royal Conservatoire in this exact exchange?
Yes, last year he did Legacy and Mother's Story.
Which I really loved. That may have been, I'll have to consult my notes, but that show last year may have been my favorite show of that Fringe, and if it wasn't, it was one of the top. So I have a lot of admiration for the author going in. The interpretation of Limbo in this is a state of being between worlds, not entirely belonging to either. And in this case, the limbo is part of the world of the story, rather than a supernatural adjunct location.
Yes, it's not a metaphysical environment, is it? It's
exactly.
Speech marks a real one within the context of the story being told. Yes.
It's a kind of social limbo. The premise
social limbo.
We are in a dystopian future of indeterminate location. There is a city, and we learn that the needs of the citizens of the city are provided by a machine whose nature is not entirely clear to us, but it apparently provides electricity, either directly or indirectly provides food and medical care. It may be that it's just keeping the generators on in the hospitals, or maybe in some way it's providing the actual food and the actual medicine. The population of the city is entirely dependent on this machine. And moreover, they are very culturally indebted to the machine. They are in a state, they treat it like a deity.
They worship the machine in a way, yes.
They do. They have a culture based around the reverence of the machine. We see them doing a strange little dance. They have some texts which are biblical in style that are all about the history of the machine and its salvation.
Received wisdom.
Exactly right. And very pertinent to the plot, one of its early functions, I think its initial function, was to stay off the impending floodwaters which threaten the city, which are apparently an ongoing threat, and the machine is the only thing keeping them at bay. So, boy, is this a great machine.
They live in their pump, essentially.
Exactly. The city obviously objectively benefits from this machine, but it has also created a kind of dark ages intellectually and creatively, where everything is very rote and bound by tradition. Everyone is expected not only to revere the machine, but to not really build upon its legacy. We don't see people saying, let's make machine version 1.2, let's figure out how to better lubricate these gears. They're all accepting the machine as is and not critical of it.
It's decadent in the sense of, not as in flamboyant parties, it's decadent as in the sense that it is a decaying society. Each generation is less impressive than the one before, and as you say, non-progressive in any kind of way. They just live with what they've got and cannot even conceive of the idea of trying to improve their lot.
There's also an emphasis put on a literalism in their culture, in that I believe there's a line to the effect of, if something isn't written down, it's not true. Now, you might interpret that as saying, oh, science and empiricism is how we get knowledge, but I think the actual meaning here is that the citizens of the city are not allowed to think beyond what has been presented to them. They're not allowed to venture intellectually or creatively beyond the given. So,
this is Galileo and the Catholic Church in the medieval period, isn't it, essentially?
Very much, I think, a parallel there. I actually interpret the machine as representing technology generally, and perhaps the internet and social media specifically. I should point out, to the credit of the show, there is absolutely nothing reminiscent of a comment on social media. It is not trying to lodge itself in contemporary times, and it's not trying to comment on Instagram or anything like that.
Well, to the point where I didn't get that reading at all, interestingly, so I agree with you. It could be interpreted, but I didn't take it that way at all.
The show could have just as easily been presented before the internet was brought to bear on our society, and it would have been just as valid in its meaning. So there's clearly a commentary here on the mixed blessing of technology. Obviously, it can provide for us and the citizens of the city benefit, but it is dangerous, as the show is telling us from the get-go, to be too dependent on this technology, and above all, to stop enabling ourselves to push forward independently and be creative, both in the artistic sense and the sense of science and innovation. And all of this is just the first few minutes of the show. This is the introductory exposition. We are shortly thereafter introduced to a 17-year-old girl named Imogen, who is a rebel culturally in that she questions the doctrine of the machine while acknowledging its value. She is not afraid to be creative when the cultural dance is, I think there's a music class or a choir class, and she does a little bit of an improv to the shock of her music teacher. So there's kind of a Footloosian conflict here, where she's an independent thinker in a society that is very ossified and stratified. And in the process of being spunky and independent, she discovers that the machine is failing. I guess it's known that the machine is failing, I should add, that it's starting to break down and the society is not equipped to fix it. But she discovers that it's failing in a fairly severe way, that its ability to stave off the floodwaters has actually been compromised. And in the process of this discovery, correct me if I'm misremembering, she is literally whisked away by the floodwaters, an encroachment of the floodwaters. And she is brought to a camp of sort of a gypsy-like outsider camp, full of refugees from the city who live outside it geographically as well as culturally, who are creative, who are independent, who are celebratory. They dance, they sing. Presumably they've got their own science going on somewhere in the mix, but they are free from both the dependence on the machine as well as the cultural reverence of the machine. And she falls into this camp and makes an adjustment period and ultimately becomes one with them, or at least seems to. That's a pretty good recap to start us off.
That absolutely sets up the context completely and takes us through several beats of the plot. Now, to me, I have to say, I think there are two clear cultural references feeding into this, but I'd be interested to hear yours first before I offer them up.
Cultural references?
In terms of literature or film, I think there are two stories which, to me at least, several beats resonate in the story that we saw when we saw City of Dreams.
Whenever I see a depiction of a totalitarian society, even a quasi-benevolent one like this, I think of 1984. Here, there wasn't quite the level of constant scrutiny as was depicted in 1984, but there was the adherence to the cultural reverence of some kind of figure.
A pervading culture of control, though, isn't there still?
Exactly
Yes.
right. A kind of bureaucracy in charge and defining every aspect of life, including artistic and cultural. That's what leaps to my mind. I'm not sure I saw too many other analogies beyond that.
Well, there's a story, it's a very famous, I think, British science fiction story called The Machine Stops, which is about people living in a machine which covers their every need, but they're blind to the fact, or they're refusing to accept the fact that the machine doesn't work as well as it used to. And the plot denouement is that the machine that fixes the machine has broken. And so as the main machine in which they all live starts to grind to a halt, it cannot be fixed and won't be fixed, and yet the society has become so dependent on it, it is unable to function itself independent's. So that seems to me to be a very heavy influence. It's a very well-known British story, I think. It's a short story, but it's been televised. It's one of those things that I think that a lot of people read at school. So that, to me, feels very similar. And then you've got, and you're right with your 1984, I think, but I think there's also Lord of the Flies, about, if you like, what happens when society starts to collapse and you get two rival factions of society. Because it turns out that, as you quite rightly point out, the more free sector of society that Imogen ends up with turns out to be as corrupt and decadent and terrible in its own way. I mean, I'm going to describe it. The way it came across to me was the organised city from which she escapes is essentially a theocratic totalitarian regime. They sort of still revere their books, and as you say, and if it's not written down, it doesn't exist, and therefore the truth can only be found in what's written. So it's all about this received wisdom, and if the received wisdom doesn't match what the requirements are, they're up a gum tree, as we discover. We then discover that the more independently minded people who sneer at the city dwellers for having lost their ability to imagine and enjoy themselves and act in free form are run as an absolutist monarchy, because there's a kind of queen character who also has several books which must never be read. They don't have received wisdom, they have hidden wisdom. And she controls the group, and she can exile people if they don't agree with her views. And so you've got these two terrible societies, and it's not going to take a genius to work out, but it takes a little bit of one and a little bit of other to find the middle way, and therefore that is our sort of a direction of plot, if you like.
And I think we're reaching here a point that I regard as the show's biggest weakness, or one of the show's weaknesses, and why the very strong promise of the setup, and I think a well-intended message, was not borne out by the actual show. I think it was a mistake, story-wise, to have the quasi-gypsy camp of free spirits actually to be so morally compromised to the point where they were not necessarily better, as you say, than the society from which Imogen had fled. I really wanted them to be good guys. I really wanted to bond with them and celebrate the fact that they retained the spirit of imagination, which in this story has a kind of magic quality to it.
Yes, creativity is what we're aspiring to here, and yet it's compromised.
Exactly, and I didn't like that. I really wanted there to be a sense of contrast. I was willing to accept that they didn't have full vision of what needed to be done. I was willing to accept that they had some resentment of the city and it took Imogen as a intermediate to resolve the problems of both camps, but they were portrayed a little too nefariously for my taste. And I felt like I was an emotional roller coaster because I didn't quite know who to like. I'm not a big fan of betrayals, honestly, in musicals, because they're too disorienting emotionally. I'm not saying that I dismiss them across the board, but in this case, it was too big of an upheaval. We just discovered the second society. We were just trying to figure out who they are, and then all of a sudden the rug is pulled out from under us, and we have to adapt to another revelation. And we just got over experiencing one revelation in a bad society. So at this point in the show, I was kind of thrown out of my emotional engagement. I thought, okay, who do I like here? Who's right? What's the message? And as long as I'm on the subject of the weaknesses of the show, at this point, the ambitious backstory of this piece began to clutter my mind. There was a lot of pre-mythology behind the events we were seeing. There was a lot of discussion of Imogen's heritage and how that the implications upon current events. There's just a lot of rules to keep track of, and as someone who reads a lot of fantasy novels, I'm no stranger to learning a lot of backstory, but in a musical that's 1 hour long, it was too much for me to digest.
I'll absolutely accept there's too much plot for an hour. It feels like it's an hour and a half, 2 hour musical, 2-act musical that's been condensed a little. I don't think it was written that way, but that's what it feels like it could be, or perhaps ought to be. So I agree with you absolutely. We are obviously concentrating here a little bit on the holes in the plot, or the difficulty that we had with the plot. My problem stems from exactly the same issue that you've identified, which is that there's too much plot, and therefore we sort of rush into the resolution and have to accept that the resolution has worked out well. So ultimately it wasn't as satisfying as it might be in terms of its narrative and the way that narrative was projected to us. I will say that I went away having to work out what happened with some friends, because I didn't think it was immediately coherent in all aspects of its denouement in particular. A lot of time had been spent on the setup, and I appreciated that, but then the rush through to a resolution, unfortunately, didn't sit as comfortably on the marvellous contextualisation that we've been given to be satisfactory for me.
I agree, and it's worth adding that this is a entirely original universe. So all the complexity is information we have to learn. This is a fantasy world, and we have to be able to understand, imagination has metaphysical existence in this world. It turns into a magical smoke that can impact the universe in a certain way. And
also, Imogen has sort of savant abilities. She can see into the future on occasions as well.
Does.
Yeah, so, it's more than just imagination. You're right.
And she's communing with the dead in the first scene. So there's a lot of rules to understand. And this is a one-act show, but if you find yourself in a musical and you're in the second half or the second act, and the songs are increasingly or still expository nature, if the music is giving you information that you need just to understand what's going on, there's a problem. Because Act 2 or the second half should really be a race towards the resolution of a story based on rules we've already learned and we've already understood. A story like Hamilton, on the other hand, can give us a lot of exposition late on because it's set in the real world, and we come to that show with a lot of real world knowledge and some understanding of the events. So it's okay for Hamilton to throw a couple of curveballs late into the show. But in a fantasy world, we need to be set up with a complete understanding of what's possible early on so that we can enjoy what happens after that and emotionally resonate with the decisions that are made.
I think that's a very fair distillation of ways of doing it and perhaps ways of not doing it. But I don't want to spend too much time saying too many negative things, because I think we've been fair in our concerns about it, but on the other hand there was a very great deal to enjoy. I mean, the world that was created was a very positive world in the sense that I felt I understood it. By the end of the show I had a much better understanding of the world than what had actually happened in the plot in some senses, as I think I've alluded to. But and the score, I think, is magnificent.
I agree. I loved the music in this piece.
And Finn Anderson is a known commodity. His music is always excellent. I've never known him to fail in that sense. And it was varied. And I know we're going to talk about one of the things that caught your imagination particularly, but the thing that caught my imagination particularly is, as you exactly said, there is this odd kind of steam which arises from the rocks naturally beneath the city, the machine city. And it is somehow or other the failure of this sort of steam, this magic steam, to be generated, that makes the machine stop. It's the fuel, basically. The fuel dries up. At the end, it is restored, and you hear this magnificent percussive representation on the actual wooden shells of various string instruments that represent, if you like, the wheezing and groaning of a mechanical piece of equipment. So as the steam is recreated, we get an excellent percussive representation of machinery, using the instruments in a really, I think, clever, unexpected way.
It was a bit of almost Ravel-like orchestration where there was a mimetic effect between the sounds of the instruments and some real-world sound. So there was, I think, slapping of an upright bass and some similar action percussion instruments. But it was charming and related to the story, so I really liked that.
But I've had enough. I'm always surprised and taken by occasions when people use their instruments in an exciting new way. I think I've mentioned him before elsewhere on another recording, but there's a recording, I think, of a piece of music called The Serpent, which is played on a piano, or possibly two pianos, and I think it's by William Borkham, but it involves the bashing of the case of the piano at various points in a percussive way, as well as the playing of the keyboard. And I find that an amazing piece of music and an amazing idea within the piece of music. So it's because it's so unexpected. You don't expect people to percussively use the cases of their instruments.
It was a nice little moment and very, very refreshing.
But there was a refreshing moment that you liked, I think.
So to contextualize this for our listeners, a lot of the score would be what I would call hybridized contemporary folk and pop influence. There's a little bit of, to me, what sounds like British Isles folk music, and then a contemporary pop influence as well. But it was...
And very accessible, by the way, I should say.
Yes, across the board. A lot of beautiful vocal writing. I think there were some a cappella sections. There's, early on, there's a chorus serenading Imogen with the sung, kind of a harmonic pyramid, singing her name, which was beautiful. And then later you realize represents her heritage calling out to her in some way, which I liked that. But atop of this very organic acoustic sound is a beatboxer who periodically emerges from the cast, because he's a cast member, and gives a percussive element to it, which is very contemporary. And not only is it impressive from the standpoint of showmanship, because it's cool to see a beatboxer, it adds a kind of contemporary sound, a distinctly contemporary sound to a score that otherwise feels like it straddles ages and genres. And that was really fresh and fun. And if you see it in person, there's just the showmanship of seeing someone with that talent at work.
And funnily enough, we spoke about this before we started recording ever so slightly, because you were raving about this particular element, and I think we were both saying that what it did, it helped raise the score even above the levels at which it was operating. Because we're presented with a fantasy world, a fairy tale in some sense, it is easy to connect musically with that environment using folk and contemporary music in exactly the way you said. So the score choices were very excellent and very appropriate. But of course, we're back to that, are we labelling things? And for me, those things marry very nicely, and therefore I will take them a little bit for granted. Whereas the moment you make something sound much more contemporary by having a beatboxer, what you're actually doing is you're saying, no, this is slightly different from what you're expecting. And then what that had to me as an audience member is a kind of, as I say, Brechtian dissonance. If I want to be poncy, and I often do, and in fact I have just wanted to, and I've done it, it gives me that Brechtian dissonance, which is actually you think, oh, what's happening now? Oh, right, the score's now doing this. This feels very different, or at least it feels naturally connected to, but very different from the tone and feel and the sense that we've been given. I'm now having to re-engage with the music and re-evaluate it, and I really like that. But actually sometimes, because it's usually the narrative that will turn a twist on you in whatever you're seeing, and you think, right, I'm now having to re-evaluate what I've been told, as we were talking about with the 12. In this case, I thought it was the score that did the twisting, in a strange sense, rather than the book. And therefore, I thought the score was not just pleasing, I thought it was clever. And in fact, I'm going to say I think it was better than the story that it was supporting. That's my view.
I would certainly agree in terms of the full sweep of the story. I did think the first half or so was utterly engaging. I loved the show until it bogged down a little bit under its own exposition. So I want to put that on the record that I was really emotionally engaged, not just intellectually. I wasn't just appreciating the man versus technology story. I really just was swept up in it. And I think with some looking onto a possible future, with some simplification of the story, it could really be great through and through.
I'd willingly see it again if it had been slightly reworked or rethought through a little, yes.
But I will circle back to what we were just saying and observe that there's this fascinating development in the vocabulary of musical theater over time, where certain devices or instrumentation or musical traditions are decontextualized and used more broadly than they were initially. So if you think of Jesus Christ Superstar, to my knowledge, it's the first musical that took the sounds of then current rock and roll and put them outside of their time and place. They used them to underscore a show set in antiquity.
Yes.
So to have Judas Iscariot underscored by electric guitars was a really interesting combination. We were taking those instruments, taking them out of the pop music context in which they originated, and finding new dramatic uses. Fast forward to Hamilton. Lin-Manuel Miranda had done a hip-hop musical, Into the Heights, but in that show, hip-hop was used in a very indigenous way. It was used for an urban story set in contemporary New York City.
It fitted, as it were.
Exactly.
Yes.
In Hamilton, he pulled the rug out from under us and used hip-hop outside of its natural environments culturally. He was drawing an analogy, to be sure, and giving the Founding Fathers a kind of gangsta vibe was part of the charm of that show. But I think he broke hip-hop free from some of its associative trappings in musical theater. And at that point forward, I think that rapping and beatboxing and urban beats and sounds like that are part of a vocabulary that can now be used comfortably in any time and place. And I think seeing a beatbox set in a future dystopia is an example of that influence. I think we'll continue to see more and more of hip-hop musical arrangement vocabulary used to tell any kind of story, and I think that's really great.
I think you hit the nail on the head perfectly there, though, when you said they can be found to have different dramatic usage. You've still got to find the right dramatic usage to make it worthwhile. You can't just write a rock score for any old story, because it's still not right for some stories, and it is right for some stories. And there will be times when actually it's conversely right for some stories. But there will always be occasions when it's not, and I can still think of bombastic rock scores which have been put on not exactly chamber musicals, but sort of musicals where actually it worked against what they were trying to do rather than with. So I still think that it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's, as with all creative things, it's more colours on your palette, it's more options and flavours, but you've still got to use them correctly to get what you want dramatically. It's still about serving the story, it's still about serving the character. So yes, you're right. We're living in a wonderful world where the options and opportunities for doing that are extending musically and stylistically, but you've still got, as the creator, to work out if it works and how it works to make it work.
I agree across the board. There always has to be a judicious selection of musical vocabulary and harmonic vocabulary and instrumentation and vocal style in a way that matches the storytelling, either in a way that seems very direct and traditional, or in a way that seems to subvert tradition but does so in a way that enhances the storytelling. And again, Hamilton is a great example of that. And I think here we have a micro example. I really liked the beatboxing as a supplement to all the folksy stuff. Interestingly, we can see an example of the reverse relationship chronologically in the show I think we discussed, which was How to Use a Washing Machine.
Oh, yes.
Where we had a very contemporary show underscored or scored with a string quartet. And here we have the reverse. We have the trappings of musical antiquity superimposed on a very contemporary story, an entirely contemporary story, and that really worked because there was a kind of sweep and pathos and emotionality to the string quartet, and a kind of agitation in a lot of the staccato lines of the writing that really supplemented that story well. It was a good choice in the reverse direction.
I think you make an excellent point, but then again, Mike, you always make excellent points, which is why it's always so much fun talking to you. So I think to boil down the Royal Scottish Conservatoire's trio for 2019, we're saying that once again, they have come up trumps. And as far as I'm concerned, I hope they carry on doing so for many more years to come.
Their offerings remain, if not my favorite, among my favorite of what I see at Fringe every year. So I really salute the creative process and the environment that both of these institutions are putting into the process. I think the idea of giving two teams a general motif has been very fruitful and provided shows that feel distant cousins in terms of their subject matter, but very distinct in style and story.
As long as they don't go ridiculously narrow in the future or something completely abstract. What you don't want is two musicals themed around the word of pepper pot or something stupid.
Actually,
although probably someone can now do that, can't they?
Yeah, I kind of want to see that show.
Shows. Well, Mike, thank you so much for talking to me about these three shows, and I look forward to talking to you again about many more shows, both this year and in the future.
Likewise. I will talk to you soon.
Remember nights in the summertime, we'd stay out late and we'd go fish off the pier. With chips for bait, we'd fish all night and never got a bite. We'd look up at the stars and guess which one was Mars. Remember Remember June was her favorite month, 'cause no more school, which meant she's back as a lifeguard at the Dash Point pool. She'd sneak us in under towels in a bin. We never had to pay, and we swam there every day. That girl is still alive. She's fighting to survive, and we can help her out. She's lost, trapped somewhere inside, trapped inside. Remember Tess on the patio with her guitar. Remember Tess and her Altima, she loved that car. Remember the girl that we knew best. Remember the girl, forget all the rest.
Remember nights after soccer games, we drive and talk. Sometimes we sat there for hours, going round her block. The world was still, the roads up Beacon Hill. We listened to the rain and kept each other sane.
Remember days in the hospital, her junior year, the way she fought through the pain and showed no fear. She'd laugh and joke and ask to bum a smoke. She'd make the nurses glare. She never seemed to care. That girl we knew before, she's lying on the floor, and we can help her up. Our Tess, buried underneath, she's still there.
She's still there, her kind of crooked smile.
She's still there, her hugs when she comes home.
She's still there, some part of her still knows.
Feel her glow.
Let her grow.
Let it show.
Let her know that we know. Remember Tess.
With those flannel shirts, just so much plaid.
Remember Tess.
And her poetry just so bad.
Remember the girl that we knew best. Remember the girl that we knew best.
Remember the girl.
Forget all the rest.
And there we are, another song from The 12 by Jonathan Bauerfeld and Casey Kendall. And as I said at the beginning of this programme, you'll be able to hear an interview with them next week about that show. And even more excitingly, if you're anywhere near New York City, you're going to be in a position to see a revised version of that show, now called The Jury, because it's going to be performed at the venue known as The Tank between the 24th and the 28th of March. To find out more, go to the website. That's www.tnny.org/ or / depending on your dialectal choices, the-jury. And tickets are on sale now. It's a great show, and you really ought to try and see it if you have any chance of doing so. To find out more about Kendall and Bauerfeld, go to their website, which is called Kendall and Bauerfeld. That's Kendall and Bauerfeld, Bauerfeld.weebly.com. And Jonathan's got his own website, that's jonathanbauerfeld.com. And if you want to go to Finn Anderson's website, you can. That's at Finn Anderson, Finn with 2 N's, .co.uk. And there's been some amazingly splendid news about our old friend Finn, because he's just been announced as this year's Cameron Mackintosh resident composer at the Lowry and the Hope Mill Theatre. A well-deserved accolade. And hopefully some very fruitful things will come from that. If you want to find out more about the Royal Scottish Conservatoire, you can do so by going simply to www.rcs.ac.uk. A very alphabetic option. And of course, finally, although by no means least, you can find out more about Mike Shapiro and his work at his website, which is mikemusic.com. Well, that just about wraps up this episode of Musical Talk. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I also hope that it's going to act as a way of whetting your appetite for the in-depth conversation I had with the very charming Casey Kendall and Jonathan Bauerfeld about their show, The 12, now known as The Jury, and you'll be able to hear that next week, so do please tune in again then. But until then, there's only time for me to say goodbye, and that's about 2 seconds, so I'll do it now. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk edited by Thos Ribbits and presented by Thos Ribbits and Mike Shapiro. Copyright Musical Talk 2020, except for the songs where the copyright remains with Jonathan Bauerfeld and Casey Kendall. And my thanks to them both for allowing me to play their excellent songs in this episode. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. Well, do you want to give me a level of it?
Sure. Let's see. I am speaking now at my comfortable conversational level. And occasionally I'll get more enthusiastic and I'll talk like this. And then sometimes I'll be more contemplative and I'll talk like this. How does that work out?
That seems to be absolutely fine to me. I notice my bland, monotonous, dull drone is coming in at extremely regular levels, so that's good too.
But for Fantasy Show, you really need to...
She's just taking television into the lavatory. Well, how long is she going to be there? Sorry.